The Institute for Health and Healing is a comprehensive integrative medicine program at Sutter Health, dedicated to healing people and transforming healthcare. Check us out at myhealthandhealing.org or on Facebook.
I'll take this opportunity to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Sara Gottfried is a physician scientist who graduated from Harvard Medical School and MIT. She's the author of 3 New York Times best-selling books, including The Hormone Cure, The Hormone Reset Diet, and Younger, a breakthrough program to reset your genes, reverse aging, and turn the clock back 10 years. Her mission at the Gottfried Institute and in life is to help women feel sexy, vital, and balanced from their cells to their souls. Dr. Gottfried practices personalized lifestyle medicine in Berkeley, California, and teaches online courses at saragottfriedmd.com. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sara Gottfried.
Thank you so much. Good. Hello and welcome. I'm so excited to see you. We've got a full house. And I wanted to start by saying I help men too. So if you're thinking, oh, where did I come? I've got some information for you as well. So I thank you so much, Gina, for an incredible presentation. Dale Bredesen is also a mentor of mine, and I think the breakthrough strategies, the 3 that I'm going to share with you tonight, will also help your brain. They're going to help you with wrinkles, they're going to help you with heart disease, they're going to help you with your blood sugar and many other things, and that also helps you with your brain. So I wanted to start first with why. Why should you care about being younger? Why should you care about the aging process in your cells? And I wanted to share an anecdotal experience, which is I had 2 models of aging when I was growing up. And you might have this too in your own family. I had a great-grandmother. Her name was Mud. Mud was a nickname because my grandfather couldn't pronounce mother. And so he called her Mud, and that stuck. She was about 50 when I was born, 51 years ago. And she was a bit of a radical. So she ate the way that Gina described. She ate a lot of vegetables, she ate fruit, she was really careful about her food choices. She didn't eat sugar. She didn't drink much wine, because she used to always say, I like wine, but it doesn't like me. I heard that as I was growing up, and I had no idea what she was talking about. And then I turned 40, and I realized, oh, I think I have the same genetics as my great-grandmother. So she practiced yoga. She learned it in the 50s. She was here in Palo Alto, and this was way before we had a yoga studio on every street corner, right? She slept on a board because she thought her spine was very important. And she would show up at our house. I grew up in suburban Maryland and then moved to Alaska. That's another story. But she would show up at our house with a suitcase of kale and wheat berries. You know, I was hoping that a great-grandmother would show up with bubble gum and like See's candy, and that was not what happened in our house. So that was Mud. She had no chronic disease. She could still do these pretzel-y yoga poses well into her 90s. When I got married in Sausalito, she was 96, and she came to my wedding. At the time, I was a third-year resident at UCSF, and she flirted mercilessly with every man that was present at the wedding and danced with them at 96. And so when I connect to my why, it's because I want to be like her. I want to be able to hang out with my great-grandchildren, go to their weddings, maybe not flirt quite as much with the men, but dance at their weddings. That's really important to me. And so I put that on you. I want to ask what your why is. Now, I had another model of aging. This was on the other side of the family. My grandmother. And when I grew up with her, I grew up just a few miles from where she lived in Maryland. And when she was in her 60s, she would pick me up from school. I had a school bus, and she would pick me up. And starting in her 60s, she would get lost as we drove home. And as time went on, she started to have personality changes. She got angry, hostile, and eventually was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease. So she had a very different arc. And she languished in a nursing home for 18 years, unable to recognize any of us. And it was just horrible to watch this woman that I love so much disappear before my eyes. So I have my grandmother that I grew up with, and then I have my great-grandmother. And in medicine, we sometimes call the type of woman that my great-grandmother was a squeaky wheel, meaning that she was cantankerous. She would argue with physicians who told her, you should take this pill for this. She really liked to ask why. She gave me lectures at the breakfast table about the merits of fish oil when I was 5 years old. But she practiced personalized lifestyle medicine way before we had a name for it. She died in her sleep at 97 of old age. There wasn't really a cause for it. But she died very peacefully. And that's what I hope for myself and for you. So we're going to talk about aging. And I want to start first with Elizabeth Blackburn. She got the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her work on telomeres. And when a woman gets the Nobel Prize, I pay attention. So she did a very interesting study. She was at UCSF for a very long time. And as a geneticist, she took a group of women, premenopausal women, and she looked at a group of women who had a sick child. And she compared them to a group of women who had healthy children. These are all women in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. And she expected that the women with the sick child would be aging faster than the women with the healthy child. But that's not what she found. She found that it didn't matter whether your kid was sick or not. What mattered was your perceived stress. And it wasn't just a few years of increased aging. She measured the telomeres, the little caps on your chromosomes that are a marker of biological aging as opposed to chronological aging. And she found that the women with a high level of perceived stress were aging a decade faster than the women with a normal amount of stress. A decade. That's a lot. So when this data was published, I immediately wanted to test my telomeres. And I also wanted to look at them in my patients because I felt like stress was the elephant in the room. It was the thing that was hard to measure and hard to address. And you start to talk about stress in the office, and people, you can just kind of see the eyes glaze over. Like, oh God, she's going to talk about stress again. And yet it's such an important issue. So when I was 45, a test became commercially available to measure telomeres. And at the time, I was eating pretty well. I was exercising regularly. I thought my stress was in a pretty good place. And so I went into the lab, got my blood drawn. The result comes back. At age 45, I have the telomeres of a 65-year-old woman. So I'm not doing very well in terms of trying to age like my great-grandmother. And so what this told me was that I was missing something. There were some gaps in the way that I was aging that I needed to understand and I needed to address. So that's what led to the book that is in your hands, Younger. And it's designed for women who want to slow down the aging process, but so much of the content is also relevant for men. And I've highlighted kind of when the data veers and separates by gender or sex. So let's talk about how your DNA is not your destiny. When I went through my medical training, and this is now a while ago, so I started medical school in 1989. I actually dropped out of a PhD program in bioengineering, and I was kind of lonely in bioengineering. I felt like if I got a PhD in bioengineering, I would be alone with the truth. And medicine just seemed a lot more collaborative and social. So I switched. And in 1989, we were taught that your genes were your destiny. That was the paradigm. And while I was at Harvard Medical School, the human genome was underway. So this was led by Francis Collins, who's now the head of the National Institutes of Health. And he coined a phrase that I think is really important, which is, genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. And what he meant by that is about 10 to 15% of your risk of disease is genetic. It varies from one disease to another, but when you're talking about Alzheimer's disease, when you're talking about heart disease, kind of the major chronic diseases, it's about 10 to 15% genetic. The rest is environment, much of which is under your control, much of which is determined by your lifestyle choices. So we're going to talk about some of those lifestyle choices tonight. So these are some of the genes that I talk about in the book. I do think genes provide an important blueprint. So for instance, if you learn that you have the ApoE4 gene, it's important information in terms of helping you determine what sort of lifestyle design to pursue. Now, some of the genes I'm going to talk about tonight include the longevity genes, mTOR, FOXO3, and SIRT2. I'm also going to talk a little bit about ApoE4, which we just heard about from Gina. And if we get to it, I'll talk about the FTO gene, which is one of the most important genes when it comes to your weight. And during the Q&A, you can ask about any of these. It's funny, when I wrote the book, I'm in this mastermind with a group of 3 other guys. And I said to them, guys, I'm so excited because I'm writing Younger, and I've narrowed it down to 25 genes that I'm going to focus on. And they were like, no one can process 25 genes. Like, you have to really narrow it down much more than that. So I narrowed it down to this and then even further in the book. So genes load the gun, environment pulls the trigger. That's the main takeaway that I want you to have tonight. So let's talk about this process of aging. And there's this term I really like, which is inflammaging, which is the unfortunate hybrid of inflammation together with aging. And you may know this already, pretty much every chronic disease is related to inflammation. So inflammation is this normal process that occurs in the body when you have an injury. The problem is, if it persists longer than a certain length of time, beyond the point at which it's advantageous for you, it can lead to this frat party inside your body that never ends. And that's what we want to avoid. So what are some of the things that cause inflammaging? Well, certainly a Western diet. I don't think people in Palo Alto eat a Western diet, but it's worth mentioning. Wear and tear. So wear and tear hormones can accelerate the inflammation process, and this is part of what was going on at UCSF with these mothers who had the high perceived stress. So the main stress hormone is cortisol, and that is a wear and tear hormone. Insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is one of those terms that, again, I think gets people's eyes to glaze over, and yet it is the most important thing I want you to pay attention to tonight. So when you leave today, I want you to be thinking insulin, 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 blood sugar, insulin, insulin, insulin. Because if you have insulin block, where your cells become numb to insulin and your blood sugar starts to climb, even if your doctor says to you, oh, your blood sugar's fine, don't worry about it, what I find in my practice is that many of the patients who come to see me don't have diabetes, but they don't have normal blood sugar. They're somewhere in between in this gray area. We sometimes call that prediabetes. So what we know is that people who have totally normal blood sugar, they have a fasting blood sugar of about 70 to 85 milligrams per deciliter, 70 to 85. People who are above that, especially into the hundreds, 105, 110, not to the diabetes range, but in that prediabetes range, that is responsible for about 60% of cognitive decline. 60%. So if you fix nothing else, if you just address your blood sugar, it's going to get you so far. It's going to really help you with your brain. And it's going to help you fit in your genes. So that's an added bonus. So you can care about your hips and you can care about your hippocampus. Very important. So another issue is intestinal permeability, loss of microbiome diversity. This is where you poke holes in your gut. And there's a lot of ways that people do this. I used to do it because I used to binge on stress. And that was one of the reasons why my telomeres were so short and stubby and were aging so fast. And then you can also measure inflammation. You can measure it in the blood with things like high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, which is one of the most important measures of how fast or slow you are aging, and homocysteine. So what helps you reverse this? We're going to talk about 3 strategies in particular. You heard a bit about what I would call a pleiotropic protocol, which means there's 36 holes in the roof with Alzheimer's disease, and we want to plug those holes. The patients that I see do not have Alzheimer's disease. I see the patients 20 to 30 to 40 years before they develop Alzheimer's disease. They have 3 holes in the roof, or they have 7 holes in the roof. And so I'm working on plugging those. But, I was talking to Maria Shriver on Monday. I was very blessed to go down and meet her. And let me tell you, she is the real deal. Like, she really cares about Alzheimer's disease. She has a charity called the Women's Alzheimer's Movement. And we were talking about, she said, what's one thing people can do to save their brains? And there really isn't one thing. You have to have this kind of multifaceted approach. If you are obsessed about just one thing, then I would say focus on the blood sugar, because that's going to take you far. But it's more than just one thing. So you have to get supportive nutrients from the food that you eat. You need lots of growth and repair hormones to balance out the wear and tear hormones. You need to have homeostasis between the two. You need to have restorative sleep. We heard a bit about that tonight, kind of the rinse or the shampoo that happens in your brain. And here's a tip. What we've learned about the glymphatic system, which is this rinse that happens in your brain at night, is that it doesn't work that well if you sleep on your back. Do we have any side sleepers in the audience? Oh, look at how many. Palo Alto, I love you. So you want to sleep on your right side. So the right side is the best for having a really good shampoo of your brain. I'm not sure why. I'm a yoga teacher, and we always, after Shavasana, we always go to our right side. I have no idea why the right side is effective. So what I do is I use pillows to kind of pin myself on the right, and then I always wake up on the left. You do what you can. So what else works? Well, of course, exercise, yoga, and meditation. We're going to get into some of the details here. Another thing that's incredibly important is a restricted eating window. So this is one of my latest obsessions, so of course you're going to hear about that tonight. And then one other thing that's crucial is connection. We heard a little bit about that from Gina. And especially what I would call tending and befriending. There's some really interesting new data in the field of social genomics, which is how kind of everyday lifestyle interactions and social interactions can change the way your genome is expressed. This is a fascinating area. We might get to it in the Q&A. So if you look at the process of aging, one of the things we know is that aging actually begins in your 30s. I didn't learn that until my 40s. I learned a little late. So, maybe let your kids know. Do we have any people in their 30s who are here tonight? Oh, fantastic. Okay. I love it. I like how you're raising your hands really high. It's fantastic. So aging, we want to get people concerned about aging as early as possible. So I'm giving a talk on Sunday about breast cancer risk reduction. And as I looked at the data on breast cancer risk reduction, I discovered that eating well, exercise, modulating the estrogen in your body, all of those things have the greatest impact the earlier that you do them. And that's generally true with disease. But I can also tell you, I had no interest in learning how to reduce the risk of breast cancer when I was a teenager or in my 20s or even in my 30s. In your 40s, you start to get worried about it because you start getting the mammograms. And so we got to start caring about this earlier, especially our brains. We need to be concerned about our brains at a much earlier age. So we know the average age in the US for the development of chronic disease is 63. And the average age for death in the US is 79. And so the idea with the kind of work that I do, that Gina does, is we want to change this paradigm. So we want the aging process to start much later than age 30. We don't want to develop any chronic disease. We want to have this really long health span, this period of time where you feel fantastic and in your prime. The way I think of it is, I want to take the best of middle age, which is 40 to 65. I want to take the best of middle age and make that last as long as possible. My great-grandmother did that, and that's what I want for you too. So let's talk about the first strategy. It's exercise. And I find that when I talk about exercise with patients, I like to get super specific. Because if you just have kind of a general policy of, yeah, you should exercise 30 minutes a day, try to get to 150 minutes per week, that's kind of the minimum. Go walking, do a little brisk walking. I don't find that that's very helpful. I also had this experience when I was in my late 40s, where I went to a spa with my husband. And have any of you done any high-intensity interval training? CrossFit? Any CrossFitters? Oh, good. They always sit in the front rows. I love it, the gunners. So I went to this high-intensity interval training class, kind of CrossFit style. And I was with my husband, who's very competitive. And the instructor, who was in his mid-30s, gorgeous, he looked at each of us and kind of sized us up, and then he put these boxes in front of us. And he put this 18-inch box in front of me. And he said, okay, our next exercise is that you're going to jump up on this box and jump off. It's called a box jump. Jump box? Box jump? Box jump, okay. So he puts it in front of me. I'm looking at it. I'm thinking, okay, I used to be a gymnast when I was a teenager, but I don't know if I can do this. And So I tried to connect to that inner gymnast. And he demonstrated, right? Like he was like a gazelle. You know, he like so easily jumped up on this box and jumped off again, no problem. And I think I'm going to wipe out. So I stand in front of it, I muster my courage, I jump up, I land, I didn't wipe out, I jumped off, and I was so proud of myself. And then he said, okay, 14 more times. And I nearly died. And the reason I nearly died is because you have these different muscle fibers, right? Do you remember this from high school biology? Now, back then, there were only 2 different types. Now there's 7. But there's a 2B muscle fiber, which is explosive. And that's the type of muscle fiber that you lose first as you get older, unless you're doing something about it. And unless you're going to CrossFit, you're working your 2Bs. Some people call them the 2X. So here's my instructor jumping up and down. And then he demonstrated up on a 3-foot-high box and like landed it. I couldn't believe it. His 2Bs were just fine. So there's lots of different ways that you can work your 2B muscle fibers. Does anyone know what this is? So it's a Peloton. And I am slightly addicted to my Peloton machine. What I love about this is that it's a combination of technology. So there's this smart screen here, touch screen, that pipes you into a live class in New York. So there are spin classes, there are high-intensity interval training classes, boot camp classes. There's treadmill classes, of course not on a bike. But there's all these different classes that you are part of. You're on a leaderboard. So if you are competitive like my husband is, this can work really well. And so I use this as a way of working my 2B muscle fibers. I also do more plyometrics now. You can also swing a kettlebell. There's lots of different ways to work your 2Bs. But it's really important that you pay attention to all your different types of muscle fibers. Don't get into the habit of your one form of exercise and that's all you do. You need to change it up. So the next strategy is intermittent fasting. And there's a lot of different ways to do this strategy. You may have heard of the 5-2 diet. There's the fasting mimicking diet, popularized by Walter Longo at USC. What I do with my patients is a pretty simple protocol where you restrict your eating to an 8-hour window. And then you have metabolic rest for 16 hours. So for some people, that means delaying breakfast. For others, that means eating dinner earlier. What I've found works the best for my patients is that they eat their first meal at 10 o'clock in the morning. They finish eating by 6 p.m. And then they have their overnight metabolic rest. Now, why is this a good idea? This is actually an ancient concept. This is the way our DNA evolved millions of years ago. So when we were running around the savannah, we weren't having breakfast, lunch, and dinner and snacks in between, right? Like that was not the way we ate. So our DNA evolved so that we had these moments of metabolic rest, long moments, like 16 hours. And we also evolved to go longer than that, into a state of mild ketosis. So the average person gets into mild ketosis at about 16 hours. And so I didn't totally believe that when I first heard it, and so I started testing myself as I started practicing intermittent fasting, and it's true. So when you're on a ketogenic diet, are there any ketogenic diet followers? Here we are again. Yes. So with the ketogenic diet, if you're someone who tests your blood in the morning, do you test your blood? You don't test. Any testers? What do you want your ketones to be in the morning? Yes, exactly. So 0.5 millimolars up to 1.0, somewhere in that range we want. So I am able to get into that range just by having a 16-hour fast. So it's a back door to ketosis. And it's very well proven to reset your physiology. So there's lots of scientific rationale for that. I'll just mention some of it. It resets insulin. Remember, I want you to be thinking insulin, 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 blood sugar when you leave. This is a really easy way to reset your insulin. It improves mental acuity. It also can help with reversing fatty liver. It increases myelin. So it has lots of brain benefits. It turns white fat beige. That's a good thing. We want that. So it increases thermogenesis. It's associated with weight loss, and it turns on SIRT1, which is one of those longevity genes that I showed you at the beginning. So it turns on longevity. And if you exercise towards the end of your fast, before you eat, that helps you to regulate mTOR. mTOR is one of those genes that you actually want to silence, you want to turn down. Gets a little confusing. So it really helps with your longevity genes. So there's this idea, if you look at all the different ways of dieting, of eating, and how that affects longevity, how it affects health span, which is our goal, one of the things that's effective is caloric restriction. Do we have any fans of caloric restriction in the room? Okay, we have two. Fantastic. Most people can't do caloric restriction. So it's estimated that less than 10% of the population can actually do it because it requires a fair amount of discipline, right? You must be a very disciplined person. But we believe that about 90 to 95% of people can do intermittent fasting. It's easier to do. Now I say that, and I also have to tell you that my best friend that I go running with every Sunday, she's the one who keeps me kind of connected to reality. I told her about intermittent fasting, and she said, "Are you kidding me? I can't go 16 hours. There's no way. I can't go that long. I'll starve." And so what we did is we started her at 12 hours. So she started with 12 hours, and sometimes you just have to meet people where they are. So she started with just 12 hours. She would finish eating by 7. She would eat at 7 o'clock the next morning. After she did that for a while, we went to 14 hours. And she was able to do that. She was able to do that twice a week. So we had this more gradual on-ramp for her to get to the point to a 16-8 protocol, 16-hour overnight fast, 8-hour eating window. So with the 16-8 protocol, what's most proven is that if you just do it one day a week, that improves longevity. If you do it twice a week, it is associated with weight loss. It resets insulin. Now, I have the kind of famine genes, the kind of insulin resistance. I have Irish relatives and I have Polish relatives, and I could survive any famine. Like, remarkable how long I could go without eating and have a stable blood sugar. So I have to do it every day to get the same benefit. It's just kind of the way I'm wired. So not everybody needs to do that. So one other longevity gene I want to mention is FOXO3. Anyone know how to turn that gene on? I talk about it in the book. So one of the best ways to turn on FOXO3 is with saunas. Saunas. So after you fix your blood sugar, after you leave, also take a sauna, because sauna turns on FOXO3. There was this incredible study published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, in 2016, where they followed about 2,500 Finnish guys. It's the kind of study you could never do in the United States. They followed these Finnish guys who had a regular sauna. So they looked at a control group that didn't do the sauna so often, and then they looked at this group of men who did saunas 4 to 7 times per week. 4 to 7 times per week. They have a different lifestyle in Finland. And they found that the men who had a sauna 4 to 7 times per week had a 50% reduction of cardiovascular mortality. 50% reduction of cardiovascular mortality. That is incredible. That is like better than any statin. They also had a 40% reduction of all-cause mortality. 40%. That's dramatic. By taking a sauna. So what does the sauna do? It's a form of moderate exercise. So the way that it affects, it stimulates your heart. In fact, it's used for people who can't exercise. It's used by folks who have heart failure. And it's a way of kind of mildly stressing the heart, a form of what we call hormesis, kind of a good stress for the body. So saunas, take your sauna after your intermittent fast. If you want to learn more about intermittent fasting, I teach a course about it, and you can learn more at Sara Gottfried M.D. /intermittent. How long to sauna? So the men in this study would sauna for 20 minutes at a minimum, 175 degrees. And so after I read this study, I go to the Claremont Hotel up in Berkeley. And I became obsessed with like making sure the temperature was right. And these poor people at the Claremont, they're like, there's that crazy science lady again. And I would, like have my timer for my 20 minutes. So there's debate about this. The best data, the best outcomes data is with the dry sauna. So the data that we have from Finland is the best epidemiologic outcomes data. But we do think that infrared sauna, which works by a different mechanism, it heats from the inside instead of from the outside like a dry sauna. Infrared saunas have their own benefits. They're just not proven in large outcome studies the way that the dry sauna is. So another unfortunate thing that happens as you get older is that your blood sugar rises. So even if you're, not eating cupcakes every day, it goes up by 10 points per decade starting in your 40s. So this is one of those things that's working against you, and you may not know about it. And I can tell you, I have patients all the time who come to see me and say, I get my fasting blood sugar checked every year by my primary care doctor, and he says it's fine. And then I look at their numbers, and their fasting blood sugar is 100, 105, 110, like it's rising as they get older. So you really want to pay attention to this. I want you to know what your fasting blood sugar is. You can also measure the average over 3 months, which is called a hemoglobin A1C. Pretty much everyone gets that measured when they have a physical. So I want you to know your number. I also want you to know your vitamin D, but that's another topic. As I mentioned, we know that glucose metabolism, if you are on this, if you're fixing your blood sugar, if you're paying attention to it, it'll help you avoid 60% of cognitive decline. 60%. So the last point that I want to make is how to fix your blood sugar. We already talked about intermittent fasting. We also talked about exercise and how working the 2B muscle fibers makes your muscles hungry for glucose. So those are 2 strategies that are already going to help you with blood sugar. So these are some additional strategies. So one of the things that's important is to understand what your carb threshold is. Now this is kind of a complicated topic. It's something that I cover in the book. But we all have different carb thresholds. So some people do better with carbs than others. When you do CrossFit, you need more carbs. So people vary in how much they need. I always thought I was a low-carb genotype. So I tested my genes, say, 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago now. And I was told that I have a low-carb genotype. So just based on my ApoE4, my ApoE gene, as well as some other genes, I'm supposed to eat a low-carb diet. But what I found, because I have adrenal issues and I have thyroid issues, I actually need some carbs. I don't do well if I go on a super low-carb diet. If I go on a strict ketogenic diet, I actually get more inflamed and I gain weight. So I need a certain amount of carbohydrates. It helps my brain function, and it makes me nicer. Just ask my husband. So my husband is a competitive athlete. He's 58, and he has a fondness for centuries and double centuries, if you know what those are. So he's a cyclist, and unless it's 100 miles and like 10,000 feet up, he is not interested. So he has to carb up when he is going on a century. So carbs really serve an important purpose. I think we are in an era right now where the pendulum has kind of swung away from carbs, and many of us have become carb phobic. But especially if you have thyroid issues or adrenal issues, you need to get your carbohydrates. So you want to define your maximum number of carbohydrates that help you feel good. There's a lot of different ways to do that. I do that personally by watching my weight and seeing, if I eat more than a certain number of carbs, my weight starts to rise. So I have a carb threshold. For me, it's about 50 to 75 grams a day, and more when I'm at my goal weight. So we all have a carb threshold, and it's something that's worth defining. Then you want to eat the minimum amount of protein. Now, this goes against a lot of what you may have learned. So one of the things we know, if you want to lengthen your health span, you want to maintain your muscle mass as you get older. You've heard that, right? You want to maintain your muscle mass. You want to measure your muscle mass, you want to measure your fat mass, and you want to maintain that number as you get older. So you want to eat enough protein that you're maintaining your muscle mass. So that requires that you measure your body fat and you measure your muscle mass as you get older. It's especially important over the age of 40. You want to control your blood sugar. That's kind of the theme song tonight. You want to eat more fiber. So about 35 to 50 grams a day. You don't want to do that all at once, but slowly build up, like 5 grams per day. And, the average American eats about 12 grams of fiber per day. That's not very much. I know in Palo Alto you eat much more fiber than that. But you want to aim for 35 to 50. And, if we go back to the way our DNA evolved millions of years ago, we were eating about 50 to 100 grams of fiber a day. That's a lot of fiber. So you don't necessarily need to get up to those numbers, but we want to be eating a lot of different species of vegetables, ideally 20 to 30 different species per week, so that you're not having salmon and broccoli every night for dinner, but you're having a lot of different types of vegetables. Why less protein? Because if you eat more protein, you convert it into sugar, blood sugar. So excess protein in the body gets converted into a higher blood sugar. So you want enough protein so that you're maintaining your muscle mass. So intermittently fasting is really important, making your muscles hungry for glucose. And then there's also supplements that can help you with blood sugar, things like berberine combined with milk thistle. Chromium, fish oil is another that helps to make you sensitive to insulin. Here's a little example of something to eat. I would add more vegetables. So I encourage people to eat a minimum of 1 pound of vegetables a day. Does that sound like a lot? You're laughing. Not 1 pound of carrots. Like 3 carrots, 3 celery, some jicama, some lettuce. We got to mix it up. Okay, so we're going to wrap this up and then we're going to get to your questions. So what is it that steals your youth? We're going to recap now. So the first thing is getting fat, losing muscle. So we know fat is not just unsightly if you have too much of it. It's metabolically active and it works against you and it accelerates the aging process. Eating too many carbs. So I was talking about carb threshold, where you define what's the minimum amount of carbohydrates that you need for optimal functioning, in my case, adrenal and thyroid functioning, but not too many. Perceiving high stress, also very important. We talked about some of the strategies for how to deal with that in Gina's talk. Meditation, yoga. I like for my patients to come up with an a la carte menu of what it is that most helps them hit the pause button. And I think that's crucially important. When I was talking to Maria Shriver, she talked about it as intestinal fortitude. What helps you create intestinal fortitude? Short sleep. So we know that you need to sleep 7 to 8.5 hours at night. I would take it one step further. I would love all of you to measure your deep sleep. So you need about 90 minutes of deep sleep every night to get that full glymphatic rinse happening. Does anyone measure their deep sleep? No? Some of you do. Okay, good. Is that part of Recode that you measure deep sleep? Your Fitbit does it. So my Fitbit does it too. So does the Oura Ring. There's lots of different ways to measure your deep sleep. Now, in my practice, I always have patients, especially men, who come to me and say, oh, no, I do fine on 6 hours of sleep or 5 hours of sleep. I do just fine. So 3% of the population has the short sleep gene where they do fine on less than 7 hours of sleep. The rest of us, the other 97%, need 7 to 8.5 hours. Isolating socially. So one of the things that happened as our genes evolved millions of years ago, besides the 50 to 100 grams of fiber, our DNA evolved to have our brain constantly look at the environment for danger, to look for the risk of physical injury. And as you might imagine, there's certain situations that are associated with physical injury. The injury doesn't actually have to occur. The brain just has to perceive that there's a high risk of physical injury. And the three things that are associated with a greater risk of physical injury are social isolation, social rejection, and social conflict. So when you're in a situation where you perceive any of those things, what happens is the brain triggers the immune system to go into alarm mode. And that is at the root of so many of our problems, so many of our autoimmune conditions and our increased risk of inflammation. So we have to actively calm ourselves down and connect with others, especially when we eat. You know, I read this statistic that I couldn't believe, that 80% of Americans eat in their car. 80%. 20% regularly eat meals in the freeway. This terrifies me when I drive on the freeway. So that is a setup for your brain perceiving risk of physical injury, right? You've got distracted driving, you're socially isolated. It's just a perfect storm for triggering your immune system to go into alarm mode. So we don't want that. So don't isolate socially, don't eat in the car. Lacking vision and purpose. And that is the end. So thank you so much. Appreciate your attention.